Welcome to my conversation with Professor Wegerif from the University of Cambridge in England. Professor Wegerif doesn't need much of an introduction, for he is a well-known writer, researcher and visionary in the field of dialogic learning. Today he will be sharing with us his unique perspective on learning.
Dialogic learning. Well, I started being interested in dialogic learning when, as a PhD student, I was surprised that the main theories in the area of learning were dominated by abstract rational approaches from Piaget. And although Vygotsky was often presented as if he was a dialogic thinker, it was noticeable that he himself said he agreed almost completely with Piaget, so there were these stages of logical development and so on. And it struck me that the relationship aspect of education was being overlooked, that really people learnt by being drawn out in relationships, and they learned from other people. Obviously their parents, significant others and teachers, but it was more than that. The whole business of education was about engaging with different cultural voices. So the process of learning was less a logical progression of structures and more like an expansion. So instead of just going from A to B, I would have thought people are going from A to A plus B. When they meet a new person, when they learn about their world, they're not replacing their own different perspective, but they're expanding their perspective. So it struck me it was very important to explore these processes whereby people learn through dialogue, through taking on the perspective of other people, being able to see from other positions, and that education as a whole could be seen as an expansion in that direction. For example, the idea of wisdom was rather lacking from models of cognitive development, but one simple definition of wisdom is when somebody can see a topic from multiple perspectives and not just from one narrow perspective. Does that answer the question about dialogic learning?
It does very much. Thank you very much. So I would actually like to ask you to elaborate further and to focus now on the concept of a dialogue, because you said that dialogic learning is about the dialogue with significant other or with just another perspective.
Oh yes, but it goes beyond that a bit.
Beyond
That's
that,
a good
yeah,
point,
right.
yeah. So dialogue's incredibly interesting because people sometimes think of a dialogue as, you can probably see from the camera there are two people sitting over there talking to each other, but of course you're already taking an objective point of view. But from the inside, to be engaged in dialogue with somebody else is to be engaged in dialogue with an outside perspective, such that you yourself are contained in their vision and they're contained in your vision. And in the dialogue, there's a kind of mutual entanglement or engagement. So even at the beginning of an utterance, you have the other person in mind. They're shaping your utterance. And that makes dialogue very different from some idea of interaction of the kind you might have. Say, for example, if you had two robots or chatterbots, they might respond to each other. But there's not a real dialogue. A real dialogue implies this opening of what I call a dialogic space, in which you have to step back from your own narrow perspective in order to be open to learning from the other and engaging with the other in a shared space where you're able to switch your ideas around. So dialogue's very interesting and quite complicated, and the key factor there, which not everyone had always focused on before, is that gap between your inside perspective and the outside perspective, the gap between two voices. Because it's not a simple gap, you can't just fill it in, you can't just bridge it. It's actually in that gap that you get the phenomenon of mutual illumination and insight and understanding. Mm-hmm. Is that... Am I being too obscure and abstract in my account? I mean, dialogues are, just look at your own experience of a real dialogue, and you'll realize that where you have to be open to being changed in some way in order to engage effectively in dialogue, and that involves a stepping back from fixed views and the opening of a space of possibilities. And the simple fact is that we never really understand other people. So it's not simply that we are changed by their ideas. We are stimulated to respond, and the response is always creative, partly because we never really understand each other, but we struggle to engage. So I guess you could define a dialogue not simply as an exchange of words or tools, but more as a creative tension, a relationship between different perspectives that engage with each other but don't merge into each other, but are held in tension. So it's a kind of new kind of identity, a sort of coupling of difference around a gap.
All right. Thank
Yeah?
you very much. It does.
Does that work?
Yes.
Oh, good.
And you mentioned the word openness quite a
Yes.
lot. So you say that to be part of this dialogue in an effective way, you have to be open to to another perspective. And I assume that openness is one of the important qualities of a dialogue. Do I understand it right?
Yes, very, very much so. I suppose it's quite a difficult concept. It relates to empathy, doesn't it? But some people have criticized empathy, quite rightly, because it sometimes implies that you uncritically accept the other position, whereas the kind of dialogic openness that I'm talking about combines the possibility of really understanding and taking on another position, but also with critical thinking, because you're never actually that other person.
Yes.
You can understand them, you can try and recreate their position, but at the same time as you're taking that other perspective, you still have your original perspective. Actually, you're probably aware of many perspectives, and therefore there's an element of comparison and criticism and judgment that comes naturally out of holding a range of different positions together at once, in tension, criticizing, challenging, questioning each other, and also generating creative new solutions. So it's openness, but it's not simply naively becoming everything you see and being unable to criticize it. You also remain outside at the same time as being able to understand from the inside. Is that too complicated? But that is the dialogic relation. That is precisely what we're talking about, the tension of differences around a gap. The gap itself is interesting, because that's where the real openness comes in. What struck me is there's more involved in a dialogue than just, say, two people engaged. Whenever you get two people together having a conversation, Bakhtin pointed out that there's always a third person, a kind of witness. Such that if I don't think you're understanding me, I will imagine an audience or somebody, another who might. Bakhtin called this the super addressee. But in a way, that perspective comes out precisely out of the dialogic relation, out of the gap. In a sense, that's the voice of the space of dialogue itself. And that is, in a sense, where true openness comes in. I feel that the challenge of engaging in an encounter with somebody who is different from you, with another voice, actually breaks down some of the fixed views we might have of reality and of ourselves in that challenge, because we never really know the other person. In that reaching to understand the other person, you open up a space of possibilities which goes beyond, maybe goes beyond the other person. And maybe the creative ideas that emerge in that space are those that surprise the other person as well as yourself. So there's a sort of true openness there in the gap of dialogue. Because I got this from Merleau-Ponty, who's a very interesting dialogic writer, philosopher. And he argued that in that gap of dialogue, or in fact he was talking about the relationship between the self and the world, it's an opening onto all the possibilities of being, which sounds a bit extreme, but you also get this interestingly if you read with David Bohm, who's writing on dialogue. Now, David Bohm contributed significantly to quantum theory. He's a serious scientist, but he's similarly arguing that a true dialogue represents a kind of an opening onto, infinite possibilities, uncontained possibilities.
So do you think that from this opening to infinite possibilities, the true creativity comes, and this is where the creativity comes from? Can we
absolutely. Now, to talk about infinite possibilities might sound a bit extreme if our experience of everyday dialogues you might often think, well, there are only a very limited number of possibilities and only a few things happen. It all seems very everyday, so why are you talking about infinite possibilities? But it's just that in any dialogue, you never actually know what could come up, what link could be made. And it's even interesting if you listen to the playful talk of children, the resonances, the jokes, the puns, and in order to explain themselves, the metaphors, where do they come from exactly? They come from a potential background which can't be contained in advance. You can't predict in advance where a dialogue is going to go. And so actually the range of possibilities is always infinite. And creativity is a funny sort of term because it's not just about infinite play, although that sounds nice, doesn't it? Usually we refer to something as creative when it's original, it's surprising, but it's also useful. We also think, that's, someone's come up with a new idea that really helps us here. And so I think the creativity comes not just from this opening of a space of possibilities, but from a certain tension between the project that you have in mind, the aim that you have, given by the context, and then that opening of a dialogic space. So before the dialogue, you have something in mind. Your project is something you want to achieve, but you put that to one side, you playfully discuss all the options. I think play is a good word in this context. And then something might emerge spontaneously, often surprisingly. So there's a tension between a fixed goal and an open space of, infinite possibilities. Is that too extreme, infinite possibilities?
No, it is really fascinating.
I mean, it sounds sort of grand, doesn't it, infinite, but it's a very simple word. It just means there are no fixed boundaries.
No fixed boundaries, exactly.
So,
exactly.
You never actually know what's going to happen.
You wrote quite a few books on dialogic learning, and they are, at least in my understanding, are meant for educators. But I would like actually to explore the topic of dialogic learning from the perspective of a learner.
Sure.
And I'm interested to hear your view on how can we use dialogic learning, or rather the theory of dialogic learning, to become more fulfilled learners.
Yes, I think it is relevant because what I mostly write about is dialogic education. So it is about how you can teach and learn more effectively through dialogue. And I guess the main message is to become more dialogic. And that means there are skills and capacities, dispositions involved in being more open to the other and being more able to learn from the other, which from a learner's point of view, could be about not rushing too much after fixed truth, but learning to become more able to remain in a space of uncertainty, where there are multiple voices, where you don't know the answer. So it's refusing sort of premature certainties, reaching after truth. And it's becoming, in a sense, resilient. It's a popular word now in education in England, this resilience, but it just means that you're not too sensitive to knockback. You're able to remain in doubt. You don't need an answer, and you're not. Also, the most important thing, I suppose, is that you don't feel the need always to defend a position, either an image of yourself or an image of your group. One way to look at this is in classroom group work in schools in England. We saw there was a tendency either to move into disputational talk, where people were trying to win the argument, and so they weren't really listening to each other, or what we called cumulative talk, where the group harmony was such that people didn't like to criticize each other. And I think although we're talking quite young children, you get this in lots of meetings with adults as well. You get the sense they're not really listening, because they don't really want, they've got a sense of their identity as a group and they don't really want it to be challenged or criticized, and they don't really listen to challenges or criticisms. Even if somebody says something that could be a criticism, it's just ignored. The conversation moves on. Or you get a position where people are basically competing to be the winner, to be the one who knows the truth, which again doesn't help very much. So as a learner, it's important to develop in yourself a certain open-minded curiosity where you can remain comfortable with that uncertain space where you don't actually know the answer, and you don't have, it is uncomfortable because it casts you into question. You can't be sure that you're right, and people like to be right all the time, don't they? So it can be undermining, but this is the source of, greater knowledge and learning. And I suppose in more practical ways, I'm talking too much now, aren't I? I'll just carry on.
It's just...
in more practical ways, you can also, of course, increasingly, social networking is very important for learning. So learning how to make use of the enormous resources that are available to anybody with access to the internet in order to ask questions, gain information. And there are, social skills involved in that. It's not that difficult to email the key people, but you have to do it. You have to do it in a way which motivates them to help you. And so there are all sorts of social networking skills you could learn to promote your learning. I think research shows that in online environments, the people who learn the most are those who have acquired these sort of social skills that will enable them to ask and network around and so on.
This is an extremely good point. As a teacher, I very often find that learners or my students struggle when they don't want to engage with others.
Yes.
Because of some fears or blocks that they may have. Some sometimes mention that they feel if they share their perspective, they will be laughed at. This is something they don't want.
Yes.
Some say that this is actually very time or effort consuming to get in touch with others. So they want to waste their energy or time or resources, as they say. And this all leads actually to, in my opinion, to certain struggles.
That's right. Yeah. So I think it is very much about your self-identification and needing to switch that. Because if you are identified with an image of yourself, either as a really good learner or as a really bad learner, either way you're not open to actually learning from other people. And so you need somehow to, I say it sounds simple, but you need to identify with the dialogue, with the learning process. And in practice, it's much easier than it sounds, because actually it's really enjoyable to get carried away, to really listen. So you wonder, what is it that blocks people from learning? What is it? Every day there's so many exciting challenges and so many stimuli or things that might stimulate you to think and to learn. And some people are so preoccupied with rather a closed image of who they are and what they're doing that they don't seem to be open to that challenge and that possibility. But we did find, when we structured, for example, classrooms such that people were talking and listening to each other, it's intrinsically enjoyable, just getting carried away in the process. And then so over time, I guess you could build confidence to realize that entering into this dialogue, although it involves a certain level of a kind of a feeling of threat and fear, because somebody might challenge you and you might have to change, if you have a positive outcome, if you find that it's actually quite exciting to move forward and try new ideas and see things from different perspectives, over time your sense of identity might shift and you become a more dialogic person who actually identifies with that process of being open and of learning.
Yeah, and this is from where you actually can feel more included in the process of learning, isn't it? Because I also get a lot of it's not actually feedback, but rather reflections from my students who say that in this or that course they struggled because they felt excluded. And there's a number of reasons for the exclusion. Sometimes they say, well, I felt that I'm not intelligent enough. I felt that others know more, or I feel that I simply do not belong to this culture because I have just moved from a different city, a different country, name it. And do you think that dialogic learning provides us with some tools that may help us to make the process of learning more inclusive?
Yes. I guess that illustrates that it's not just about the attitudes of the learner. It's also about the whole culture you're in. And there are cultures, classroom cultures, local cultures as well, which will tend to label people and stratify them and be closed to outsiders. So one thing, certainly as a teacher or educator, you can do quite concrete measures to change the culture. For example, making people aware of the assumptions they're making and then teaching new assumptions. And often very simple, call them ground rules for talk, or very simple changes in expectations, can shift a culture in a classroom, for example. We have some quite good evidence that the inclusion of children who were quiet or had English as an additional language, who didn't speak the language in the same way as the others, was greatly helped in small group work by simply getting the other children or young people to ask everybody, what do you think? And have that as normal, that everyone would be included, would be asked a question. And in dialogues, it's interesting that it's not always the most intelligent people that contribute most significantly to the movement of the dialogue. Often the intelligent people think they have all the answers, and they need someone, well, maybe less intelligent, but simply asking why, getting them to explain, challenging. So you can participate effectively in a dialogue in many ways and at many levels, and everybody can feel included in the end. But it's more than just although it helps to be resilient, it helps to keep asking questions, it helps not to take too seriously the judgments of others. But on the other hand, you can't do it all on your own, and it is important that we try and develop inclusive cultures that respect differences and are willing to learn from them. And that is the implication of dialogic learning. It's not an individual thing. At the end of the day, it's a collective thing. And it does depend on respecting otherness and difference, because you might be able to learn from it. I was pausing there because it doesn't mean everything's wonderful in its own way, everything's great. Not at all. You can be totally critical. But what you have to also be humble in recognizing that you don't have all the answers. And therefore, this other position, however bad it might seem, there might be something there you could learn from. And even if you can just learn a little bit from it, it's worth being open to that possibility, because that's the only way we actually grow. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely.
So respect for difference is essential to collective learning, which doesn't just mean being nice to everybody, but it's a genuine position of intellectual humility, because unfortunately, at the end of the day, it is true that you don't know everything, and you might be able to learn from someone else.
But this is the beauty of our existence, that we don't know all the answers. Because this is how we learn, how we develop, how
that means
we
we're open
evolve,
to participate in larger processes.
Yeah, otherwise, the whole existence wouldn't be that interesting, that exciting, if we knew the answers.
Well, I think so, but you obviously agree with me already.
And I think that this is all I had to ask today.
Oh, great. Okay.
Thank you very much, because somehow you answered the questions even before I had it in my mind, as if you were reading it.
Oh, well, I do hope it's useful, but if you've got any other questions, at any point, anybody just come and ask me, and I'll see if I can help or not.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to talk to you, and I hope it's useful.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.